Doing a top 10 list position by position for the last 51 years. Divisional era play, 1969 to the present. Bob Costas is with us. Bob, we've gotten along so far, but I think things are about to change. Left field, now we're confronted with more steroid-addled players. We have to deal with players who are at their peak right around the cusp of the late 60s, early 70s. So this, for me, was a very difficult top 10. How about you?
Yeah, it's a difficult one. And as we said in previous installments of this series, there are overlapping criteria. For me, performance-enhancing drugs might keep a marginal guy out of the top 10. It might lower someone from third to fifth or sixth in some lists or others. But I'm not disqualifying anybody because of performance-enhancing drugs, especially in the case of my number one left fielder, because if he had retired in 1998, not only would Barry Bonds top this list, but he would be an inner circle Hall of Famer and in the discussion of the greatest players, all-round players of all time. So,
all right,
I have Bonds first.
You're going with, let me just stop you there for a second, Bob. You're going with skinny, because this is what I did last year, and I did this with Mad Dog Russo for the last 100 years, and we had to confront this. I chose to judge the skinny version of Barry Bonds. Skinny Barry was a great player, so you're judging just skinny Barry Bonds before he went to the Giants and got huge?
Yeah, it would be a closer call between Skinny Barry and Rickey Henderson, but I would still put him at number one. He was just a terrific all-around player, Gold Glover, stole bases, hit for average. Obviously, he became something inauthentic late 90s on to the end of his career, but he is an all-time great player. So Bonds is first, Rickey Henderson second. Pete Rose, by the way, the producer said we have to consider him as a left fielder. Third base, second base, first base, I don't know which category he goes in. For the purpose of this, because of this historical significance. Three, there are a lot of objectionable things about Manny Ramirez, not just the PEDs, but his indifference in left field and as a base runner, and openly quitting on two different teams. Puts him in a bad light, but he is one of the greatest right-handed hitters of all time. He goes fourth. Rice is fifth. Albert Bell was a monster for admittedly not that long a stretch of time, but I put him there. Matt Holliday, terrific all-round player. Tim Raines was a force, no question. Yaz, if you were talking about 1960 on, would be much higher. We'll get to that in a minute. And Lou Brock, okay? Lou Brock was a tough one because I had to leave George Foster off. It was between Foster and Brock. Now, you and I have gone back and forth on this. Brock had great seasons in the 60s, and his season resume is entirely World Series play before divisional play, just before the divisional era, 64, 67, 68. I don't know if we're allowed to count that, but I put Brock on there because in 74, he broke what was then Maury Will's single season record. A few years later, he broke Ty Cobb's all-time stolen base record. He got his 3,000th hit in his final season of 1979 because I think he is more historically significant than George Foster. He made the list.
Yeah, we did this a little differently, and I think we're in accord on most things. But Lou Brock, for me, was a player from the previous generation, where he wasn't peaking after 1969. Karl Yasrimski was still leading the league in hitting in 1970. So was Billy Williams. So I have Karl Yasrimski number one. Yastrzemski was a monster. He had 11 win seasons, to use WAR, in 1967. Look back at his record if you're too young to remember. Yastrzemski was a dominant offensive force and an all-time great. I struggle. I think the classic case is Yaz versus Rickey, because Rickey is a one-of-a-kind. The all-time great leadoff man. I could easily have him number one. And then it became down between Pete Rose and Skinny Barry Bonds. I'm just using Skinny Barry. And you know what? Pete Rose did play all those positions. I'll use this terminology again. Bob, he was a flat-out winner. Despite the reputation now, that guy playing baseball was an inspiration to the country. And also hit in the playoffs, contact hitter, switch hitter, the whole deal. I'll take Pete Rose over Skinny Barry Bonds. Then I go Tim Raines. Billy Williams is an underrated player, great player. And because he was still peaking in 1970, I'll count him. Manny Ramirez was a great hitter. I'm giving him a real shot because I don't know where Skinny Manny and Big Manny converged. I don't know, but I know he was great, but I'm not putting him higher than seventh. Jim Rice was a monstrous offensive player. And then, yeah, Ryan Braun did have his peak years. Now he's also a player with PEDs all around him. And then I have George Foster at 10. So, yeah, I would feel better going with your number 10, Lou Brock, over my number 9, Ryan Braun, but I'll put him in there. I also, Matt Holliday and Albert Bell were just missed for me. But let's get to the top. Like, I think, yeah, like Yaz was still leading the league in hitting 1970, Bob. 9 is too low.
Yeah, he was. Look, I'm a little bit older than you, Brian. I remember the 1967 pennant race. We lived on Long Island. I would climb up on the roof and move the antenna around so we could get WTIC out of Hartford and watch Red Sox games. That was the last truly great pennant race because the Tigers and Cardinals both ran away with it in '68. You want to talk about a most valuable player, which is not just the player of the year, which is a separate thing. I can't think of a player that I have seen who was truly more valuable and more significant over the course of a season and in a pennant race than Karl Yasrimski in 1967.
Yep.
A great left fielder, and he wins the Triple Crown, but so many big hits. Now, if I was allowed to truly consider that, then I'd elevate him. I don't think I'd put him ahead of Bonds and Henderson. I'd elevate him. But as you enter the division, Leary, yes, he won a batting title in 1970, but he becomes an all-star player through the 70s and into the early 80s as he plays into his 40s. He becomes an all-star player. He's an all-time great player if you consider the entire body of his career. So that was my reasoning. And your last two guys, Braun and Foster, were my last two deletions. So we're substantially in accord.
But, I mean, you love Yastrzemski so much, you have him number 9. I just want to point that out. You're climbing on the roof to hear Karl Yasrimski, and here you go, you put him in at number 9. If I'm going to count a guy, Bob, I'm bringing his whole career in.
Yeah. If that's the criteria, I may go back and tweak some of my lists for the upcoming shows.
Please tweak. Tweak away.
Think about this. Think about this. You're talking top 10 for a half century of baseball. It's not an insult to be anywhere on this list.
Oh.
It's a tip of the cap.
That's all right. It's a small tip of the cap. And last year when we did the live ball era, that's 100 years of baseball. I really think Rickey Henderson's place is unique. Now, Tim Raines was a version of him. Eddie Collins was a great leadoff man. Joe Morgan, obviously an all-time great and could lead off. But if you're actually putting together a team, Bob, I think if you don't have Rickey Henderson, there's nothing to approximate him. So I think Rickey actually could be number 1. I have him in at number 2.
I have him at 2. I mean, I just can't disrespect what Barry Bonds was. Barry Bonds, I've said this a million times, it's a broken record. The home run record, both single season and career, is inauthentic. But was Barry Bonds one of the greatest players of all time in the conversation of the 10 best position players of all time on his natural merits? Yes. So I have no qualms about putting him number 1 on this list.
All right. I would, but I would, again, trying to look at it, and this is kind of an honor, and the inauthentic nature of it, cheating the game, and yet it did happen. If we were doing a list saying, hey, they allowed these guys out on the field to play and put those records up, that happened as well. But we're not having that discussion here. Good list, Bob. We disagreed on this, but it can happen. We'll see you next time.